Welcome to the Nerdjacker's Vault. Today we are reading Book 1 of Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Hellenistic philosopher Sextus Empiricus, translated by Benson Mates, Part 1. The main difference between the philosophies. When people search for something, the likely outcome is that either they find it, or not finding it, they accept that it cannot be found, or they continue to search. So also in the case of what is sought in philosophy, I think some people have claimed to have found the truth, others have asserted that it cannot be apprehended, and others are still searching. Those who think that they have found it are the dogmatists, properly so called, for example, the followers of Aristotle and Epicurus, the Stoics, and certain others, the followers of Cleitomachus and Carneades, as well as other academics, have asserted that it cannot be apprehended. The skeptics continue to search. Hence, it is with reason that the main types of philosophy are thought to be three in number: the dogmatic, the academic, and the skeptic. Concerning the first two, it will best become others to speak. But concerning the skeptic way, we shall now give an outline account, stating in advance that as regards none of the things that we are about to say, do we firmly maintain that matters are absolutely as stated, but in each instance we are simply reporting, like a chronicler, what now appears to us to be the case. Part 2. The Accounts of Skepticism. One account of the skeptic philosophy is called general, the other specific. In the general account we set forth the characteristic traits of skepticism, stating its basic idea, its origins, arguments, criterion, and goal, as well as the modes of epoche or suspension of judgment, and how we take the skeptic statements and the distinction between skepticism and the competing philosophies. In the specific account, we state objections to each part of so-called philosophy. Let us, then, first take up the general account, beginning the exposition with the various terms for the skeptic way. Part 3. The nomenclature of the skeptic way. The skeptic way is called zetetic or questioning from its activity in questioning and inquiring, affectic or suspensive from the pathos that arises concerning the subject of inquiry, aporetic or inclined to aporia either, as some say, from its being puzzled and questioning about everything, or from its being at a loss as to whether to assent or dissent, and Pyrrhonian, because it appears to us that Pyrrho applied himself to skepticism more vigorously and conspicuously than his predecessors did. Part 4. What skepticism is. The skeptic way is a disposition to oppose phenomena and noumena to one another in any way whatever, with the result that, owing to the equivalence among the things and statements thus opposed, we are brought first to epoche and then to ataraxia. We do not apply the term disposition in any subtle sense, but simply as cognate with to be disposed. At this point, we are taking as phenomena the objects of sense perception, thus contrasting them with the noumena. The phrase, in any way whatever, can modify both the word disposition, so as to make us take that word in a plain sense, as we said, and the phrase to oppose phenomena and noumena. For since we oppose these in various ways, phenomena to phenomena, noumena to noumena, or alternando phenomena to noumena, we say in any way whatever, in order to include all such oppositions. Or we can apply in any way whatever to phenomena and noumena, in order that we may not have to inquire how the phenomena appear or the noumena are thought, but may take these terms in their plain senses. By opposed statements we simply mean inconsistent ones, not necessarily affirmative and negative. By equipollence we mean equality as regards credibility and the lack of it, that is, that no one of the inconsistent statements takes precedence over any other as being more credible. Epoche is a state of the intellect on account of which we neither deny nor affirm anything. Ataraxia is an untroubled and tranquil condition of the soul. In our remarks on the goal of skepticism, we shall come back to the question of how ataraxia enters the soul along with epoche. Part 5. The skeptic. The definition of the Pyrrhonian philosopher is implicitly contained in that of the skeptic way. He is the person who has the aforementioned disposition. Part 6. The Origins of Skepticism. We say that the causal origin of the skeptic way is the hope of attaining ataraxia. Certain talented people, upset by anomaly in the facts, and at a loss as to which of these facts deserve assent, endeavored to discover what is true in them and what is false, expecting that by settling this they would achieve ataraxia. But the main origin of skepticism is the practice of opposing to each statement an equal statement. It seems to us that doing this brings an end to dogmatizing. Part 7. Does the skeptic dogmatize? Then we say that the skeptic does not dogmatize. We are not using the term dogma, as some do, in its more common meaning, something that one merely agrees to. For the skeptic does give assent to the pathé that are forced upon him by a fantasia. For example, when feeling hot or cold, he would not say, "I seem not to be hot or cold." But when we assert that he does not dogmatize, we use dogma in the sense, which others give it, of assent to one of the non-evident matters investigated by the sciences. For the Pyrrhonist assents to nothing that is non-evident. Not even in putting forward the skeptic slogans about non-evident things does he dogmatize. Slogans like "nothing more," or "I determine nothing," or any of the others of which we shall speak later. For the dogmatizer propounds as certainty the things about which he is said to be dogmatizing, but the skeptic does not put forward these slogans as holding absolutely. He considers that, just as the "all things are false" slogan says that together with the other things it is itself false, as does the slogan "nothing is true," so also the "nothing more" slogan says that it itself is no more the case than its opposite, and thus it applies to itself along with the rest. We say the same of the other skeptic slogans. So that since the dogmatizer is one who posits the content of his dogmas as being true, while the skeptic presents his skeptical slogans as implicitly self-applicable, the skeptic should not be said to dogmatize thereby. But the most important point is that in putting forward these slogans, he is saying what seems to him to be the case, and is reporting his pathos without belief, not firmly maintaining anything concerning what exists externally. Part 8. Does the skeptic have a system? We proceed in the same way when asked whether the skeptic has a system. If one defines a system as an attachment to a number of dogmas that agree with one another and with appearances, and defines a dogma as an assent to something non-evident, we shall say that the skeptic does not have a system. But if one says that a system is a way of life that, in accordance with appearances, follows a certain rationale, where that rationale shows how it is possible to seem to live rightly being taken, not as referring only to virtue, but in a more ordinary sense, and tends to produce the disposition to suspend judgment, then we say that he does have a system. For we do follow a certain rationale that, in accord with appearances, points us toward a life in conformity with the customs of our country and its laws and institutions, and with our own particular pathé. Part 9. Does the skeptic theorize about nature? We reply in the same vein if asked whether the skeptic needs to theorize about nature. On the one hand, if there is a question of making an assertion with firm confidence about any of the matters dogmatically treated in physical theory, we do not theorize. But on the other hand, in the course of opposing to every statement an equal statement, and in connection with ataraxia, we do touch upon physical theory. This, too, is the way we approach the logical and ethical parts of so-called philosophy. Part 10. Do the skeptics deny appearances? Those who claim that the skeptics deny appearances seem to me not to have heard what we say. For, as we stated above, we do not reject the things that lead us involuntarily to assent in accord with a passively received fantasia, and these are appearances. And when we question whether the external object is such as it appears, we grant that it does appear, and we are not raising a question about the appearance, but rather about what is said about the appearance. This is different from raising a question about the appearance itself. For example, the honey appears to us to be sweet. This we grant, for we sense the sweetness. But whether it is sweet we question insofar as this has to do with the philosophical theory, for that theory is not the appearance, but something said about the appearance. And even when we do present arguments in opposition to the appearances, we do not put these forward with the intention of denying the appearances, but by way of pointing out the precipitancy of the dogmatists. For if the theory is so deceptive as to all but snatch away the appearances from under our very eyes, should we not distrust it in regard to the non-evident, and thus avoid being led by it into precipitate judgments? Part 11. The criterion of the skeptic way. That we hold to the appearances is obvious from what we say about the criterion of the skeptic way. The word criterion is used in two ways. First, for the criterion that is assumed in connection with belief about existence or non-existence, and that we shall discuss in our objections. And second, for the criterion of action, by attention to which in the conduct of daily life we do some things and not others. It is of the latter that we are now speaking. Accordingly, we say that the criterion of the skeptic way is the appearance, in effect using that term here for the fantasia. For, since this appearance lies in feeling and involuntary pathos, it is not open to question. Thus nobody, I think, disputes about whether the external object appears this way or that, but rather about whether it is such as it appears to be. Holding to the appearances, then, we live without beliefs, but in accord with the ordinary regimen of life, since we cannot be wholly inactive. And this ordinary regimen of life seems to be fourfold. One part has to do with the guidance of nature, another with the compulsion of the pathe, another with the handing down of laws and customs, and a fourth with instruction in arts and crafts. Nature's guidance is that by which we are naturally capable of sensation and thought. Compulsion of the pathe is that by which hunger drives us to food and thirst makes us drink. The handing down of customs and laws is that by which we accept that piety in the conduct of life is good and impiety bad, and instruction in arts and crafts is that by which we are not inactive in whichever of these we acquire, and we say all these things without belief. Part 12. What is the goal of skepticism? After these remarks, our next task is to explain the goal of the skeptic way. Now the goal or end is that for the sake of which everything is done or considered, while it, in turn, is not done or considered for the sake of anything else, or it is the ultimate object of the desires. We always say that as regards belief, the skeptic's goal is ataraxia, and that as regards things that are unavoidable, it is having moderate pathe. For when the skeptic set out to philosophize with the aim of assessing his fantasia, that is, of determining which are true and which are false, so as to achieve ataraxia, he landed in a controversy between positions of equal strength, and, being unable to resolve it, he suspended judgment. But while he was thus suspending judgment, there followed by chance the sought-after ataraxia as regards belief. For the person who believes that something is by nature good or bad is constantly upset. When he does not possess the things that seem to be good, he thinks he is being tormented by things that are by nature bad, and he chases after the things he supposes to be good. Then, when he gets these, he fails into still more torments because of irrational and immoderate exultation, and fearing any change, he does absolutely everything in order not to lose the things that seem to him good. But the person who takes no position as to what is by nature good or bad neither avoids nor pursues intensely. As a result, he achieves ataraxia. Indeed, what happened to the skeptic is just like what is told of Apelles the painter. For it is said that once upon a time, when he was painting a horse and wished to depict the horse's froth, he failed so completely that he gave up and threw his sponge at the picture. the sponge on which he used to wipe the paints from his brush, and that in striking the picture the sponge produced the desired effect. So, too, the skeptics were hoping to achieve ataraxia by resolving the anomaly of phenomena and noumena, and being unable to do this, they suspended judgment. But then, by chance, as it were, when they were suspending judgment, the ataraxia followed, as a shadow follows the body. We do not suppose, of course, that the skeptic is wholly untroubled, but we do say that he is troubled only by things unavoidable. For we agree that sometimes he is cold and thirsty, and has various feelings like those. But even in such cases, whereas ordinary people are affected by two circumstances, namely by the pathae themselves, and not less by its seeming that these conditions are by nature bad, the skeptic, by eliminating the additional belief that all these things are naturally bad, gets off more moderately here as well. Because of this, we say that as regards belief, the skeptic's goal is ataraxia, but in regard to things unavoidable, it is having moderate pathae. But some notable skeptics have added suspension of judgment during investigations to these. Part 13. The general modes of epoche. Since we have been saying that ataraxia follows on suspending judgment about everything, the next thing would be to explain how we reach this suspension. Roughly speaking, one may say that it comes about through the opposition of things. We oppose phenomena to phenomena, or noumena to noumena, or alternando. For instance, we oppose phenomena to phenomena when we say that the same tower appears round from a distance but square from close up, and noumena to noumena when, in reply to one who infers the existence of divine providence from the order of the heavenly bodies, we oppose the fact that often the good fare ill and the bad fare well, and deduce from this that divine providence does not exist. And noumena to phenomena, as when Anaxagoras argued, in opposition to snow's being white, that snow is frozen water and water is dark in color, and therefore snow is dark in color. Or, with a different concept of opposition, we sometimes oppose present things to present things, as in the foregoing examples, and sometimes present things to things past or to things future. For example, when somebody brings up an argument that we are not able to refute, we say to him, "Just as before the birth of the person who introduced the system which you follow, the argument supporting that system did not yet appear sound, although it really was, so also it is possible that the opposite of the argument you now advance is really sound, despite its not yet appearing so to us, and hence we should not yet assent to this argument that now seems so strong." But in order that we may more accurately understand these oppositions, I shall set down the modes or arguments by means of which suspension of judgment is brought about, without, however, maintaining anything about their number or their force. For they may well be unsound, and there may be more than the ones I shall mention. Part 14. The 10 modes. The older skeptics, according to the usual account, have handed down some modes, 10 in number, through which it seems that suspension of judgment is brought about, and which they also synonymously call arguments or points. And these modes are as follows. First, there is the one based on the variety of animals. Second, the one based on the differences among human beings. Third, that based on the differences in constitution of the sense organs. Fourth, on the circumstances. Fifth, on positions, distances, and locations. Sixth, on admixtures. Seventh, on the quantity and constitution of the external objects. Eighth, on relativity. Ninth, on the frequency or infrequency of occurrence. And 10th, on ways of life, customs and laws, mythic beliefs and dogmatic opinions. We adopt this order without prejudice. Superordinate to these are 3 modes, one based on what does the judging, another based on what is judged, and a third based on both. The first 4 of the 10 modes are subordinate to the mode based on what does the judging, for that is either an animal or a human being or a sense, and is in some circumstance. The 7th and 10th modes are referred to the mode based on what is judged, and the 5th, sixth, eighth, and ninth are referred to the one that is based on both. These three in turn are referred to the relativity mode, making it the most generic, with the 3 as specific and the 10 as subordinate. We offer the foregoing comments as plausible concerning their number. Concerning their content, we say the following. The first argument, as we were saying, is that according to which the same phantasiae do not arise from the same things because of the difference of animals. This we conclude from the difference in the ways animals are produced and from the variety in the structures of their bodies. As concerns the ways they are produced, some animals are produced without sexual union and others from intercourse. And of those produced without sexual union, some come from fire, like the tiny creatures that appear in ovens, some from stagnant water, like mosquitoes, some from wine that is turning, like gnats, some from earth, like... This part of Outlines of Pyrrhonism is lost. The next available part starts with some from slime, like frogs from mud, like worms, some from donkeys, like dung beetles, some from greens, like caterpillars, some from fruit, like the gall insects in the wild fig tree, some from rotting animals, like bees from bulls and wasps from horses. Of animals produced by intercourse, some, the majority, come from homogeneous parents, and others, like mules, from heterogeneous parents. Again, of animals in general, some are born viviparously, like human beings, others oviparously, like birds, and still others just as lumps of flesh, like bears. So one would expect these dissimilarities and differences of origin to result in great contrariety of pathe, contributing incompatibility, disharmony, and conflict. However, it is the differences among the most important parts of the body, especially those naturally fitted for judging and sensing, that can produce the greatest conflict of the phantasiae. Thus, things that appear white to us are said to be yellow by people with jaundice, and reddish by those with bloodshot eyes. Since then, some animals have yellow eyes, others bloodshot eyes, others white, and still others some other color, it is likely, I think, that their perception of colors will be different. Further, if we look long and fixedly at the sun and then stoop down to a book, the letters seem to us golden and moving around. Since then, some animals have by nature a luster of the eyes and emit a fine and quick stream of light, so as even to be able to see at night, we should expect that external objects would not affect them and us in the same way. And illusionists, by treating lamp wicks with copper rust and cuttlefish ink, make the bystanders appear now copper-colored and now black, just by a slight sprinkling of the mixture. It is surely all the more reasonable that, since differing humors are mixed in the eyes of animals, these animals will have differing phantasia of the external objects. Also, when we press the eyeball on one side, the forms, shapes, and sizes of the things seen appear elongated and narrowed. So it is likely that those animals that have elongated and slanting pupils, for example, goats, cats, and such, will in their phantasiae experience the external objects as different from and unlike what animals with round pupils take them to be. Mirrors, too, because of their differing construction, sometimes show the external objects as very short when the mirror is concave, and sometimes as long and narrow when it is convex. And some show the head of the reflected person at the bottom and the feet at the top. Since then, some of the organs of sight are bulging with convexity, and others are quite concave, while still others are in a fiat plane. It is likely that because of this, the phantasiae, too, are various, and that dogs, fish, lions, human beings, and locusts do not see the same things as equal in size or similar in shape. But in each case, what is seen depends on the imprint created by the eye that receives the appearance. The same argument holds for the other senses as well. For how could one say with regard to touch that animals are similarly affected whether their surfaces consist of shell, flesh, needles, feathers, or scales? And as regards hearing, how could one say that perceptions are alike in animals with a very narrow auditory canal, and in those with a very wide one, or in those with hairy ears and those with ears that are hairless. Indeed, even we find our hearing affected one way when our ears are plugged, and another way when we use them ordinarily. Smell, too, will differ according to the variety of animals. For if we ourselves are affected in one way when we have a cold with a lot of phlegm, and in another way when the parts about the head are filled with an excess of blood, in the latter case being repelled and feeling virtually assaulted by things that seem to others to smell sweet, then, since some animals are flabby and phlegmatic by nature, others very rich in blood, and still others have a predominant excess of yellow or black bile, it is reasonable to suppose that this makes odoriferous things appear differently in each case. So too with the objects of taste, since some animals have rough and dry tongues, and others very moist. And when in a fever we ourselves have relatively dry tongues, we consider the food offered to us to be earthy, bad tasting, and bitter, and we feel thus because of the differing strength of the humors said to be in us. Since then, the animals too have differing organs of taste, with different humors predominating, they would get differing taste fantasia of the external objects. For just as the same food, when digested, becomes in one place a vein, in another an artery, in another a bone, and in still another a tendon, and so on, showing a differing disposition depending on the difference of the parts receiving it. And just as water, one and the same in form, when applied to trees becomes bark in one place, branch in another, and blossom in another, and thus finally fig, pomegranate, and each of the other fruits. And just as one and the same breath of the musician, when blown into a flute, becomes here a high note and there a low note, and the same stroke of the hand on the lyre produces here a bass sound and there a treble one, so too it is likely that the external objects are perceived differently depending on the differing make-ups of the animals having the fantasia. But one can see this more clearly from the preferences and aversions of animals. Thus, perfume seems very pleasant to human beings, but intolerable to dung beetles and bees, and the application of olive oil is beneficial to human beings, but kills wasps and bees. And to human beings, seawater is unpleasant and even poisonous to drink, while to fish it is most pleasant and potable. And pigs bathe more happily in the worst stinking mud than in clear and pure water. And, of animals, some eat grass and others cat bushes, some eat wood and others seeds or meat or milk, some like their food aged and others fresh, and some like it raw and others like it prepared by cooking. And in general, the things that are pleasant to some animals are unpleasant, repugnant, and even poisonous to others. Thus, hemlock fattens quails and hyoscyamus fattens pigs, and pigs enjoy eating salamanders, as the deer enjoy eating poisonous creatures and swallows enjoy blister beetles. Ants and mosquitoes, when swallowed by human beings, produce discomfort and stomach ache, whereas the she-bear, if she feels somehow weak, is strengthened by licking them up. The adder is stupefied by the mere touch of a branch of oak, and the bat by a leaf of the plane tree. The elephant fears the ram, the lion the rooster, sea monsters the crackling of bursting beans, the tiger the sound of a drum. And it is possible to give further examples, but that we may not seem more prolix than necessary, if the same things are unpleasant to some but pleasant to others, and if the pleasure and unpleasantness lie in the fantasiae, then differing animals receive different fantasiae from the external objects. But if the same things do appear differently because of the difference of animals, then we shall be in a position to say how the external object looks to us, but we shall suspend judgment on how it is in nature. For we shall not be able to decide between our fantasiae and those of the other animals, since we are part of the dispute, and thus are in need of someone to make the decision, rather than competent to pass judgment ourselves. Besides, we shall not be able to give preference, whether with or without proof, to our fantasiae over those of the non-rational animals. For in addition to the possibility of there being no such thing as a proof, as we shall point out, any purported proof will either be apparent or not apparent to us. And if, on the one hand, it is not apparent, then we shall not accept it with confidence. But if, on the other, it is apparent to us, then since what is apparent to animals is the very matter in question, and the proof is apparent to us animals, the proof itself will be in question as to whether, as apparent, it is true. But it is absurd to try to settle the matter in question by means of the matter in question, since the same thing will be both credible and not credible, which is impossible. Credible insofar as tending to prove, not credible insofar as needing proof. Therefore, we shall not have a proof justifying us in preferring our own phantasiae to those of the so-called non-rational animals. If, therefore, the phantasiae differ because of the difference of animals, and it is impossible to decide between them, then it is necessary to suspend judgment concerning the external objects. But for good measure, we go on to match up the so-called non-rational animals with human beings as regards phantasiae. For after our serious arguments, we do not consider it unseemly to poke a little fun at the dogmatists, wrapped, as they are, in the fog of their discussions with themselves. We usually take the non-rational animals as a group when comparing them with human beings, but since in groping for an argument the dogmatists say that the comparison is unfair, we shall for even more good measure carry our joking still further and base the argument on just one animal, the dog, if you will, which seems to be the humblest of all. For we shall find that even in this case the animals that are the subject of the argument are not inferior to ourselves as regards the credibility of the appearances. So then, the dogmatists acknowledge that this animal differs from us in sensation, for it perceives more by the sense of smell than we do, being able by this sense to track wild animals that it cannot see, and with its eyes it sees them more quickly than we do, and its sense of hearing is more acute. Next, let us consider reasoning. One kind of reasoning is internal, the other is expressed. Let us first look at the internal kind. This, according to those dogmatists who at the moment are our chief opponents, namely the Stoics, seems to involve the following: acceptance of the familiar and avoidance of the alien, knowledge of the arts related to this, possession of the virtues pertaining to one's proper nature, and of those having to do with the pathe. Now then, the dog, the animal upon which, as an example, we decided to base the argument, chooses what is congenial to him and avoids the harmful, bunting for food and withdrawing before the raised whip. Furthermore, he has the art, namely hunting, to provide the congenial. Nor is without virtue. For certainly if justice is giving to each according to his deserts, the dog, who fawns on and guards his family and benefactors, but wards off strangers and malefactors, would not be lacking in justice. And if he has this virtue, then in view of the unity of the virtues he has them all, which the wise tell us is not the case with the majority of mankind. And we see him valiant and smart in his defending, to which Homer bears witness when depicts Odysseus as unknown to all the people of the household, but recognized by the dog Argus alone. The dog was not deceived by the physical changes in the man, nor had he lost his apprehensive fantasia, which he clearly retained better than the human beings did. And according to Chrysippus, who was certainly no friend of non-rational animals, the dog even shares in the celebrated dialectic. In fact, this author says that the dog uses repeated applications of the fifth undemonstrated argument schema when, arriving at a juncture of three paths, after sniffing at the two down which the quarry did not go, he rushes off on the third without stopping to sniff. For, says this ancient authority, the dog in effect reasons as follows: the animal either went this way or the other. He did not go this way, and he did not go that. Therefore, he went the other. Furthermore, the dog is aware of and can deal with his own pathe. For when a thorn has got stuck in him, he hastens to remove it by rubbing his foot on the ground and by using his teeth. And when he has a wound anywhere, he gently licks off the accumulated pus, since dirty wounds are hard to cure, while clean ones are easily healed. Indeed, he follows very well Hippocrates' prescription, since immobility cures the foot. Whenever his foot is injured, he holds it up and keeps it undisturbed so far as possible. When he is troubled by humors that do not agree with him, he eats grass and then regurgitates the uncongenial material along with it and gets well. Since then, it is apparent that the animal upon which, as an example, we have rested the argument chooses what is congenial and avoids what is troublesome, and possesses the art of obtaining the congenial, and is aware of and able to deal with his own pathe, and furthermore is not without virtue, in which elements consists the perfection of internal reasoning, the dog would thus far be without deficiency, which I suppose is why certain philosophers, the Cynics, have honored themselves with the name of this animal. Concerning reasoning as expressed externally, it is not necessary at present to inquire, for even some of the dogmatists have deprecated it as counterproductive to the acquisition of virtue, and for this reason they used to practice silence during their schooling. And anyhow, supposing that a person is unable to speak, no one will infer that he is non-rational. But leaving these points aside, we certainly observe animals, the subject of our discussion, uttering quite human sounds like jays, for instance, and others, and letting this too pass, even if we do not understand the utterances of the so-called non-rational animals, it is not at all improbable that they are conversing although we do not understand. For when we bear the talk of barbarians, we do not understand that either, and it seems to us undifferentiated sound. Moreover, we bear dogs making one sound when they are keeping people away, and another when they are howling, and one sound when they are beaten, and a different one when they are fawning. In general, if somebody were to study the matter, he would find a great difference of sounds uttered by this and the other animals according to different circumstances. And so for that reason it may fairly be said that the so-called non-rational animals have their share of externally expressed reasoning, and if they are neither inferior to human beings in the acuteness of their senses, nor in internal reasoning, nor, on top of that, in externally expressed reasoning, then as concerns phantasiae, they are not less worthy of belief than we are. It is also possible to show this, I think, by basing the argument on each kind of non-rational animal. For instance, who would not say that birds excel in shrewdness and employ externally expressed reasoning? For they have knowledge not only of things present, but also of the future, and by prophetic sounds or some other signs they reveal these things in advance to people who can understand them. As I previously indicated, I have made this comparison for good measure, having sufficiently shown, I think, that we cannot prefer our own phantasiae to those of the non-rational animals. But if the non-rational animals are not less worthy of belief than we are when it comes to deciding about phantasiae, and the phantasiae differ depending on the variety of animals, then although I shall be able to say how each of the external objects appears to me, I shall be forced, for the reasons stated above, to suspend judgment as to how it is in nature. Such, then, is the first mode of epoché. We said that the second was the one based on the differences among human beings. For even if it were granted, by way of supposition, that human beings are more to be believed than the non-rational animals, we shall find that even consideration of our own differences leads to suspension of judgment. For human beings are said to be composed of two elements, the soul and the body, and we differ from one another in respect to both of them. As regards the body, we differ in form and constitution. The body of a Scythian differs in form from that of an Indian, and the variation is produced, they say, by the differing relative strengths of the humors. Depending on this difference in relative strength of the humors, there arise differing phantasiae, as we pointed out in the first mode. So too, these humors produce a great difference in the choice and avoidance of things external. Indians like some things and we like others, and liking different things is an indication of receiving differing fantasiae from the external objects. In consequence of our peculiarities of makeup, we differ in such a way that some of us digest beef better than rockfish, or get diarrhea from the weak wine of Lesbos. There was, it is said, an old woman of Attica who safely drank 30 drams of hemlock, and Lysis took 4 drams of opium without trouble. And Demophon, who waited table for Alexander, used to shiver in the sun or the bath, but felt warm in the shade. The Argive Athenagoras felt no pain when stung by scorpions and venomous spiders. The Selaeans, as they are called, are not harmed when bitten by asps or other snakes, nor are the Egyptian Tenteritae harmed by crocodiles. Further, the Egyptians who live along the Astapus River opposite Lake Meroe safely eat scorpions, snakes, and the like. And Rufinus of Chalcis, when he drank hellebore, neither threw up nor suffered any laxative effect, but he took it and digested it as though it were something to which he was accustomed. Chrysermus the Herophilian, if he ever used pepper, risked a heart attack, and Sotericus the surgeon, whenever he smelled fried fish, got diarrhea. Andron the Argive was so immune to thirst that he even traveled through the Libyan desert without needing anything to drink. Caesar could see in the dark, and Aristotle tells of a certain Thasian. To it seemed that a human phantom was all the time leading him around. Since there is so much variation among human beings as regards the body, and it suffices to mention only a few of the cases that the dogmatists provide, it is likely that human beings will also differ among themselves as regards the soul. For the body is a kind of image of the soul, as indeed of physiognomy shows. But the greatest indication of the vast and limitless difference in the intellect of human beings is the inconsistency of the statements of the dogmatists concerning what may be appropriately chosen, what avoided, and so on. The poets, too, have expressed themselves appropriately about these things. For Pindar says the crowns and trophies of his storm-foot steeds give joy to one, yet others find it joy to dwell in gorgeous chambers gold-bedecked. Some even take delight in voyaging over ocean's billows in a speeding bark. This part of Outlines of Pyrrhonism is lost. The next available part starts with, and the poet says one person delights in one activity, another in another. Odyssey, Book 14. Verse 228. Tragedy, too, is full of such things. If the same things were beautiful and wise for everybody, there would be no disputatious strife among mankind. Euripides, Phoenicy, lines 499 and 500. It is strange that the same thing should be pleasing to some mortals and hateful to others. This part of Outlines of Pyrrhonism is lost. The next available part starts with, since, then, choice and avoidance are in pleasure and displeasure, and pleasure and displeasure lie in sense and fantasia, when the same things are chosen by some people and avoided by others, it is logical for us to infer that these people are not affected alike by the same things, since if they were, they would alike have chosen and avoided the same things. But if the same things produce different effects depending on the difference of human beings, this too would reasonably lead to suspension of judgment, and we would perhaps be able to say what each of the external objects appears to be, relative to each difference, but we would not be able to state what it is in nature. For we shall either have to give credence to all human beings or to some. But if to all, we shall be attempting impossibilities and accepting contradictory statements, and if to some, let the dogmatists tell us to whom we should give assent. The Platonist will say, to Plato, and the Epicurean, to Epicurus, and the others analogously, and thus with their unsettled disputes they bring us again to suspension of judgment. Anyone who says that we ought to give assent to the majority view is making a childish proposal, For no one is able to approach the whole human race and by talking with them find out what pleases the majority. Indeed, there may be peoples of whom we know nothing, but among whom attributes that are most rare among us are common, while the attributes most common among us are rare among them. So that, for example, most of them feel no pain when bitten by spiders, while a few, on rare occasions, do, and analogously with the other idiosyncrasies previously mentioned. Of necessity, therefore, suspension of judgment comes in again via the differences of human beings. While the dogmatists egoistically claim that in deciding the facts, preference ought to be given to themselves above all other human beings, we realize that this claim of theirs is inappropriate since they themselves are part of the dispute. And if, giving preference to themselves, they make a decision about the appearances, by entrusting the decision to themselves, they beg the question before the deciding is begun. In any case, in order to arrive at suspension of judgment by an argument dealing with only one person, their ideal sage, for example, who is expert at interpreting dreams, we take up the third mode in the list. This mode is the one that we say is based on the difference of the senses. That the senses differ from one another is obvious from the start. For instance, to the eye it seems that paintings have hollows and prominences, but not to the touch. And for some people honey seems pleasant to the tongue, but unpleasant to the eye. Consequently, it is impossible to say without qualification whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And likewise in the case of perfume, for it pleases the sense of smell but displeases the taste. So too with spurge juice. Since it is painful to the eyes but painless to all the rest of the body, we will not be able to say without qualification whether, insofar as its nature is concerned, it is painful or painless to bodies. And rainwater is beneficial to the eyes, but it is rough on the windpipe and lungs, as is olive oil despite its being soothing to the skin. The stingray, when it touches the extremities, produces numbness, but it can touch the rest of the body harmlessly. Hence we shall not be able to say how each of these things is in its nature, but only how it appears to be in each instance. More examples can be given, but in order not to delay carrying out the purpose of our essay, the following point needs to be made. Each thing that appears to us in sensation seems to affect us as complex. For example, the apple seems smooth, fragrant, sweet, yellow. But it is not evident whether it really has these and only these qualities, or whether having only one quality, it appears differently depending on the different constitutions of the sense organs, or again, whether it has more qualities than are apparent, but some of them do not affect us. That it has one quality could be argued on the basis of what we previously said about the food taken up by the body and the water taken up by the tree and the air breathed into flutes and pipes and similar instruments. For the apple, too, may be of one form, but appear differently because of the difference of the sense organs through which it is perceived. And that the apple has more qualities than those that appear to us, we can reason as follows. Suppose that someone is born having the senses of touch, smell, and taste, but can neither bear nor see. Then he will assume that the origin of his perceptions is not something visible or audible, but that it has only those three types of quality which he is capable of perceiving. And it is possible that we, with only our five senses, perceive only those qualities of the apple that we are fitted to perceive, and that perhaps there are other qualities, affecting other sense organs which we lack, and for which we consequently cannot perceive any corresponding objects. But nature, someone like Aristotle may say, has made the senses exactly proportionate to the objects of sense. But what is this nature, seeing that there is so much unresolved controversy among the dogmatists concerning its very existence? For anyone who decides this question, that is, whether nature exists, will have no credibility with them if he is an ordinary person, while if he is a philosopher he will be part of the controversy, and instead of being a judge will be subject to judgment himself. So that if it is possible that only those qualities exist in the apple which we seem to perceive, or that there are more than these, or again that there are not even the ones that affect us, what the apple is like will be none evident to us. The same argument holds also in the case of the other objects of sense. And since the senses do not apprehend the external objects, the intellect is not capable of doing so either, so that this argument, too, seems conducive to suspension of judgment concerning the external objects. In order that we shall be able to reach suspension of judgment when basing the argument on each single sense or even disregarding the senses, we take up further the fourth mode of apoke. This is the one described as based on circumstances, where by circumstances we mean conditions. We say that it is concerned with being in a natural or unnatural condition, with being awake or asleep, with dependence on age, on being in motion or at rest, on baiting or loving, on being in need or satisfied, on being drunk or sober, on predispositions, on being courageous or fearful, on being distressed or cheerful. Thus, things affect us in dissimilar ways depending on whether we are in a natural or unnatural condition, as when people who are delirious or possessed by a god seem to bear spirits but we do not. Similarly, those people often say that they perceive odors of storax or frankincense or some such thing, and much else too, although we do not sense them. And the same water that seems to us to be lukewarm seems boiling hot when poured on an inflamed place. And the same coat appears tawny orange to people with bloodshot eyes, but not to me. Also, the same honey appears sweet to me, but bitter to the jaundiced. Further, if someone says that an intermingling of certain humors produces, in persons who are in an unnatural condition, odd fantasiae of the external objects, it must be replied that since healthy people, too, have intermingled humors, it is possible that the external objects are in nature such as they appear to those persons who are said to be in an unnatural state, but that these humors are making the external objects appear to the healthy people to be other than they are. For to give the power of altering the external objects to some humors but not to others is arbitrary. Since just as the healthy in a natural state have the nature of the healthy, and in an unnatural state that of the sick, so too the sick in an unnatural state have the nature of the healthy, and in a natural state that of the sick, so that credence should be given to these last too, as being in a relatively natural state. Different fantasiae come about too, depending on whether we are asleep or awake. For when we are awake, we do not imagine au phantasmatha what we imagine when we are asleep, nor when we are asleep do we imagine what we imagine when awake, so that whether the fantasiae are the case or are not the case is not absolute but relative, that is, relative to being asleep or awake. It is fair to say, then, that when asleep we seek things that are not the case in the waking state, though not absolutely not the case, for they are the case in our sleep, just as what we see in our waking state is the case, though not in our sleep. Depending on age, too, different fantasiae arise, since the same air seems cold to the aged but temperate to those who are in their prime, and the same color appears faint to older people, but vivid to those in their prime, and likewise the same sound appears faint to the former, but clearly audible to the latter. And people of differing ages are moved in different ways depending on their choices and aversions. For instance, children are interested in balls and hoops, but people in their prime prefer other things, and the elderly still others. From this we conclude that, also depending on differences of age, differing fantasiae arise from the same external objects. Objects appear differently, too, depending on whether one is in motion or at rest. For things that we see as stationary when we are at rest seem to be moving when we are sailing by, depending on liking and disliking also. For some people are completely repelled by pork, while others eat it with the greatest of pleasure. Whence Menander, too, said, "Look how his face appears now that he has come to this, like an animal. It is acting justly that makes us fair." And many people who have ugly mistresses think them beautiful. Depending on hunger and satiety, too, since the same food seems very pleasant to the hungry, but unpleasant to the sated. And depending on being drunk or sober, since things we consider shameful when we are sober appear to us not to be shameful when we are drunk. And depending on predispositions, since the same wine that appears sour to people who have previously eaten dates or figs seems sweet to those who have eaten nuts or chickpeas, and the vestibule of the bathhouse is warm to those entering from outside and cold to those leaving, if they have spent some time in it. And depending on being afraid or feeling courageous, since the same thing seems frightful and terrible to the timid, but not at all so to the hold. And finally, depending on being distressed or cheerful, since the same things that are annoying to people who are distressed are pleasant to those who are cheerful. Since, therefore, there is so much anomaly depending on conditions, and human beings are in one condition at one time and another at another, how each external object appears to each person is easy to say, I suppose, but not how it is, since the anomaly is unresolved. For anyone resolving it is either in one of the aforementioned conditions, or is in no condition at all. But to say that he is in no condition at all, for example, neither healthy nor sick, neither in motion nor at rest, nor of any particular age, and devoid of the other conditions as well, is completely absurd. But if he, being in some condition, makes a decision about the fantasiae, he will be part of the dispute, and in other ways not a pure or fair judge of the external objects, because he has been contaminated by the conditions he is in. The waking person cannot compare the fantasiae of sleepers with those of people who are awake, nor can the healthy person compare those of the sick with those of the healthy. For we assent to things that are in the present, and move us in the present, more than to things that are not in the present. In another way, too, the anomaly of such fantasiae is unresolved. For anyone preferring one fantasia to another, or one circumstance to another, either does this without making a decision and without giving proof, or by making a decision and giving proof. But he will not do it without these means, for then he will not be credible, nor will he do it with them either. For if he makes a decision about the fantasiae, he will certainly decide by means of a criterion, and certainly he will either say that this criterion is true or that it is false. But if he says that it is false, he will not be credible. And if he says that the criterion is true, either he will say this without proof, or he will say it with proof. Again, if he says it without proof, he will not be credible, but if with proof, the proof will certainly need to be true if he is to be credible. When he affirms the truth of the proof which he is taking to establish the credibility of the criterion, will he have made a decision about this or not? If he has not made the decision, he will not be credible, and if he has made the decision, then it is obvious that he will say that he has decided by means of a criterion, in order that it may be maintained, and the criterion has need of a proof, in order that it may be shown to be true. And neither is it possible for a proof to be sound without the prior existence of a true criterion, nor for a criterion to be true without the previously confirmed proof. And thus the criterion and the proof fall into the circularity type of aporia, in which both are found not to be credible, for each, while it awaits the credibility of the other, is equally incredible with the other. Therefore, if nobody, with or without a proof and criterion, is able to give one fantasia preference over another, then the differing fantasiae that arise depending on the different conditions will be undecidable, so that this mode, too, leads to suspension of judgment concerning the nature of the external objects. The fifth argument is that depending on positions, distances, and locations, for, depending on each of these, the same things appear different. For example, the same stoa viewed from either end appears tapering, but from the middle completely symmetrical, and from afar the same boat appears small and stationary, but from close up large and in motion, and the same tower appears round from afar, but square from close up. These depend on distances, but depending on locations, the same lamplight appears dim in the sunshine, but bright in the dark, and the same oar appears broken when it is in the water and straight when it is out, and the egg soft when it is in the bird, but hard when it is in the air, and the ligory liquid in the lynx, but hard in the air, and coral soft in the sea, but hard in the air, and sound appears one way in a pipe, another in a flute, and still another when it is simply in the air. And depending on positions, the same portrait appears smooth when tilted back, but when tilted forward a certain amount, it seems to have depths and prominences. And the necks of pigeons appear different in color depending on the different angles of inclination. Therefore, since everything apparent is viewed in some location and from some distance and in some position, each of which produces a great deal of variation in the phantasiae, as we have remarked above, we shall be forced also by this mode to have recourse to suspension of judgment. And anyone wishing to give preference to some of these phantasiae will be attempting the impossible. For if he makes his assertion simply and without proof, he will not be credible. Whereas, supposing that he wishes to use a proof, if he says that the proof is false, he will confute himself, while if he says that it is true, he will need a proof of its being true, and again a proof of that, since it too must be true, and so on ad infinitum. But it is impossible to produce infinitely many proofs, and so he will not be able by means of a proof to give one fantasia preference over another. And if one cannot decide about the aforementioned phantasiae either with or without a proof, suspension of judgment results, for I suppose, of any given thing we are able to say of what sort, relative to its particular position, distance, and place, it appears to be, but for the above reasons we cannot state of what soft it is in its nature. The sixth mode is the one that depends on admixtures, and according to which we conclude that, since none of the external objects affects us by itself, but always in combination with something, it is perhaps possible to say what the mixture of the external object and that together with which it is observed is like, but we cannot do the same for the external object considered by itself. It is obvious from the start, I think, that none of the external objects affects us by itself, but always does so in combination with something, and that depending on this it is observed as different. Thus our own complexion is seen as of one hue in warm air, and as of another in cold air, and so we cannot say how our complexion is in nature, but only how it looks together with each of the two kinds of air. Further, the same sound appears one way in thin air and another in dense air, and spices are more pungent in the bathhouse and in the sun than in very cold air, and the body is light when immersed in water, but heavy in air. In order to get away from just external admixtures, our eyes contain within themselves both membranes and liquids. Since things seen are not observed without these, they will not be accurately apprehended, for it is the mixture that we perceive, and because of this the jaundiced see everything yellow, while those with blood in the eyes see things as blood-red. And since the same sound appears of one quality in open places, and of another in places that are narrow and winding, and of one quality in clear air and another in murky air, it is likely that we do not perceive the sound in and of itself, for the ears have narrow and winding passages, and are contaminated by vaporous effluvia said to be conducted from places around the head. Moreover, since there are substances in the nostrils and in the areas of taste, we perceive the objects of taste and of smell together with these, and not in and of themselves. Therefore, because of the admixtures, the senses do not perceive precisely how the external objects are. Nor does the intellect do so either, especially since its guides, the senses, go wrong. Perhaps it too contributes some special admixture of its own to the reports of the senses. For we observe that there are humors situated around each of the places in which the dogmatists suppose that the ruling part of the soul is located, whether the brain or the heart or whatever part of the animal anyone wants to put it in. And so by this mode also we see that, being unable to say anything about the nature of the external objects, we are forced to suspension of judgment. The seventh mode, we said, is that depending on the quantity and constitution of the external objects, giving constitution its common meaning, namely combination. It is obvious that by this mode, too, we are forced to suspend judgment about the nature of the objects. For example, shavings off a goat's horn appear white when observed by themselves and not in combination, but when they are combined in the substance of the horn, they look black. And individual filings of a piece of silver appear black, but when united with the whole, they affect us as white. And pieces of Taenarian marble look white when they are polished, but combined in the whole stone, they appear yellow. And grains of sand, when scattered, appear rough, but when gathered together in a dune, they affect our senses as soft. And hellebore, taken when fine and light, tends to choke one, but not when coarse. And wine, when drunk in moderation, strengthens us, but when taken in excess, disables the body. And food, similarly, exhibits different powers depending on the amount. Often, indeed, by being taken in too great quantity, it brings the body down with indigestion and diarrhea. So here, too, we shall be able to say of what quality the shaving of horn is, and of what quality the combination of many shavings is, and the same for the particle of silver and the combination of many particles, and for the bit of Taenarian marble and the combination of many bits. And we can make relative statements in the case of the grains of sand and the hellebore and the wine and the food too, but we still cannot state the absolute nature of the things because of the anomaly of phantasiae, depending on combination. It seems that in general even beneficial things become harmful when they are used in immoderate quantities, and the things that seem hurtful when taken in excess are harmless in small quantities. The best indication of this point is what is observed in regard to the powers of medicines, in which the exact mixing of the simple drugs produces a compound that is beneficial, but the occasional slightest error in weighing, when overlooked, makes it not only not beneficial, but even quite hurtful and often poisonous. So the argument relating to quantities and constitutions muddles the existence of the external objects. Consequently, this mode too may be expected to lead us around to suspension of judgment, for we are unable to say anything without qualification about the nature of the external objects. The eighth mode is the one based on relativity, where we conclude that, since everything is in relation to something, we shall suspend judgment as to what things are in themselves and in their nature. But it must be noticed that here, as elsewhere, we use are for appear to be, saying in effect everything appears in relation to something. But this statement has two senses. First, as implying relation to what does the judging, for the object that exists externally and is judged, appears in relation to what does the judging. And second, as implying relation to the things observed together with it. As for example, what is on the right is in relation to what is on the left. And indeed, we have taken into account earlier that everything is in relation to something. For example, as regards what does the judging, that each thing appears in relation to this or that animal or person or sense, and in relation to such and such a circumstance. And as regards the things observed together with it, that each thing appears in relation to this or that admixture or manner or combination or quantity or position. But it is also possible to prove by a special argument that everything is in relation to something, as follows. Do the things that are what they are, by virtue of a difference, differ from the things that are in relation to something, or not? If they do not differ, then they too are in relation to something. If they do differ, then, since whatever differs is in relation to something, for it is called what it is in relation to that from which it differs, the things that are what they are by virtue of a difference are in relation to something. And according to the dogmatists, of things that are, some are summa genera, others are infime species, and others are genera and species. But all these are relative. Again, of things that are, some are pre-evident and others are non-evident, as they say. The appearances signify, and the non-evident things are signified by the appearances. For, according to them, the appearances are a view of the non-evident. But what signifies and what is signified are relative. Therefore everything is relative. Moreover, of things that are, some are similar and others are dissimilar, and some are equal and others are unequal. But these things are relative. Therefore everything is relative. And even the person who says that not all things are relative confirms the relativity of all things. For by the arguments he opposes to us, he shows that the very relativity of all things is relative to us and not universal. Now, when we have shown that all things are relative, the obvious result is that as concerns each external object, we shall not be able to state how it is in its own nature and absolutely, but only how, in relation to something, it appears to be. It follows that we must suspend judgment about the nature of the objects. In connection with the mode based on the constancy or infrequency of occurrence, which we say is the ninth in order, we consider such items as the following. The sun is certainly a much more marvelous thing than a comet. But since we see the sun all the time, but the comet only infrequently, we marvel at the comet so much as even to suppose it a divine portent, but we do nothing like that for the sun. If, however, we thought of the sun as appearing infrequently and setting infrequently, and as illuminating everything all at once and then suddenly being eclipsed, we would find much to marvel at in the matter. And earthquakes are not equally troublesome to the person who is experiencing one for the first time and to the person who has become accustomed to them. And how marvelous is the sea to the person who sees it for the first time. And a beautiful human body that is seen suddenly and for the first time excites us more than if it were to become a customary sight. Things that are rare seem precious, but things that are familiar and easy to get do not. Indeed, if we thought of water as rare, how much more precious it would appear than all the things that do seem precious. And if we imagine gold simply scattered on the ground like stones, to whom do we think it would then be precious and worth hoarding away? Since, then, the same things, depending on whether they occur frequently or infrequently, seem at one time marvelous or precious, and at another time not, we infer that we shall perhaps be able to say how each of these appears when it occurs frequently or when it occurs infrequently, but that we shall not be able to state without qualification how each of the external objects is. And accordingly, via this mode too, we withhold assent as regards them. The 10th mode, which is principally concerned with ethics, is the one depending on ways of life and on customs, laws, mythic beliefs, and dogmatic suppositions. A way of life is a chosen basis for living or for some particular action, adopted by one person or many, for example by Diogenes or the Laconians. A law is a written agreement among the citizens, the violator of which is punished. A custom or common practice, for there is no difference, is the joint acceptance by a number of people of a certain way of acting, where the violator is not in all cases punished. Thus, there is a law against adultery, and for us it is a custom not to have intercourse with a woman in public. A mythic belief is the acceptance of things that are not the case and are fictional, such as, among others, the myths about Cronus, and in which many people place credence. And a dogmatic supposition is the acceptance of something that seems to be established by analogy or some kind of proof, such as that there are atomic elements of things, or homoiomeres, the ultimate particles of matter, or minima, or other things. And we oppose each of these items sometimes to itself and sometimes to each of the others. For example, we oppose custom to custom thus. Some of the Ethiopians tattoo their babies, but we do not. And the Persians think it becoming to wear brightly colored garments that reach to the feet, but we consider it unbecoming. And whereas the Indians have intercourse with women in public, most others consider this shameful. We oppose law to law thus. Among the Romans, he who gives up his patrimony does not pay his father's debts, but among the Rhodians he always pays them. And among the Tauri of Scythia there was a law that foreigners were to be sacrificed to Artemis, but with us it is forbidden to kill a human being at the temple. And we oppose a way of life to a way of life when we set Diogenes' way of life in opposition to that of Aristippus, or that of the Laconians to that of the Italians. We oppose a mythical belief to a mythical belief, when in one place we say that according to myth Zeus is the father of men and gods, while in another we say that it is Oceanus, referring to the line, Oceanus, the source of the gods, and Tethys, the mother. Iliad, Book 14, verse 201. And we oppose dogmatic opinions to one another when we say that some people assert that there is just one element and others that there are infinitely many, and that some assert that the soul is mortal and others that it is immortal, and that some assert that our affairs are arranged by divine providence, while others assert that they are not. We also oppose custom to the other items to law. For example, when we say that among the Persians sodomy is customary, but among the Romans it is prohibited by law. And with us adultery is prohibited, but among the Massagetae it is by custom treated as a matter of indifference, as Eudoxus of Cnidos reports in the first book of his travels. And with us it is forbidden to have intercourse with one's mother, whereas with the Persians this sort of marriage is very much the custom. And among the Egyptians men marry their sisters, which for us is prohibited by law. Custom is opposed to way of life when, whereas the majority of men have intercourse with their wives in some place apart, Crates did it with Hipparchia in public, and Diogenes went around with shoulders bare, while we dress in the usual way. And custom is opposed to mythical belief, as when the myths say that Cronus ate his own children, it being customary among us to take care of children. And whereas with us it is customary to worship the gods as being good and immune from evil, they are presented by the poets as being wounded by and envious of one another. Custom is also opposed to dogmatic opinion, when with us it is the custom to pray to the gods for good things, whereas Epicurus says that the divinity does not care about us, and when Aristippus thinks it a matter of indifference whether one wears women's clothing, while we think this shameful. We oppose way of life to law when, though there is a law against striking a free and well-born man, the Pancratiasts hit one another because of their way of life, and when, though homicide is forbidden, the gladiators kill one another for the same reason. Further, we oppose mythical belief to way of life when we point out that the myths say that Heracles in the house of Omphale carded wool and endured slavery, and did these things which nobody would choose to do, even to a moderate degree, whereas Heracles' way of life was noble. We oppose way of life to dogmatic supposition when athletes undertake an onerous way of life for the sake of glory, on the supposition that glory is good, while many philosophers dogmatize that it is an evil thing. And we oppose law to mythical belief when the poets present the gods as practicing adultery and sodomy, while with us the law prohibits doing these things. And we oppose law to dogmatic opinion when the Chrysipians say that intercourse with mothers or sisters is a matter of indifference, while the law prohibits these things. Further, We oppose mythical belief to dogmatic supposition when the poets say that Zeus came down and had intercourse with mortal women, whereas this is deemed by the dogmatists to be impossible. And the poet says that Zeus, because of grief over Sarpedon, let fall a shower of blood upon the earth. Iliad, Book 16. Verse 459. While it is a dogma of the philosophers that the divinity is impassive, and when the philosophers reject the myth of the hippocentaurs, while offering us the hippocentaur as a paradigm of non-existence. For each of the foregoing oppositions, it was possible to take many other examples, but in an outline these will suffice. At any rate, since by this mode too, so much anomaly in the facts has been shown, we shall not be able to say how any external object or state of affairs is in its nature, but only how it appears in relation to a given way of life or law or custom, and so forth. And so because of this mode too, we must suspend judgment about the nature of the external facts. Thus, via all 10 modes, we end up with suspension of judgment. 15. The 5 modes. The more recent skeptics hand down the following 5 modes of epoche. The first is the mode based on disagreement. The second is that based on infinite regress. The third that based on relativity. The fourth on hypothesis. And the fifth is the circularity mode. The one based on disagreement is that according to which we find that, both in ordinary life and among philosophers, with regard to a given topic, there has been reached an unresolvable impasse on account of which we are unable to reach a verdict one way or the other, and we end up with suspension of judgment. The one based on infinite regress is that in which we say that what is offered as support for believing a given proposition is itself in need of such support, and that support is in need of other support, and so on ad infinitum, so that, since we have no place from which to begin to establish anything, suspension of judgment follows. The one based on relativity is, as we said before, that in which the external object appears this way or that way in relation to the judging subject and the things observed at the same time, but we suspend judgment as to how it is in its nature. And the one based on hypothesis comes into play when the dogmatists, involved in an infinite regress, begin with something that they do not establish, but that they deem worthy of acceptance as agreed upon without question or demonstration. And the circularity mode occurs when what ought to make the case for the matter in question has need of support from that very matter. Whence, being unable to assume either in order to establish the other, we suspend judgment about both. That every matter of inquiry can be brought under these modes we shall show in brief as follows. Anything proposed for consideration is either a sense object or a thought object, but whichever it is, there is a disagreement concerning it. For some people say that only the sense objects are true, others that only the thought objects, and still others that some of each. Now, will they say that the disagreement can be decided or that it cannot? If it cannot, we have the conclusion that one must suspend judgment, for concerning disagreements that are not decidable, one cannot make an assertion. On the other hand, if it is decidable, then we want to know how it is to be decided. Shall we decide about a sense object, for example? For first we shall base the argument on this case by a sense object or a thought object. If by a sense object, then, since the sense objects are what our inquiry is about, this object too will need something else as support. And if that also is a sense object, it again will need support from another one, and so on ad infinitum. But if we are to decide about the sense object by a thought object, then since there is a disagreement about the thought objects too, and this is a thought object, it also will be in need of decision and support. But by what will it be supported? If by a thought object, it will similarly involve an infinite regress. But if by a sense object, then, since a thought object was used as support for a sense object and a sense object for a thought object, the circularity mode of epoche comes in. But if, To avoid these points, our interlocutor should think to assume something, by consent and without demonstration, as a basis for demonstrating what follows. The hypothesis mode comes into play and allows no way out. For if the hypothesizer is worthy of credence, we shall be no less worthy of credence whenever we hypothesize the opposite. And if what the hypothesizer hypothesizes is true, he makes it suspect by taking it as a hypothesis instead of establishing it. But if it is false, the underpinnings of the things being established will be rotten. Further, if hypothesizing contributes something to credibility, we might as well hypothesize what is in question and not something else from which the hypothesizer is going to establish the point at issue. And if it is absurd to hypothesize what is in question, it will also be absurd to hypothesize a proposition superordinate to this. That all sense objects are relative is evident, for they are relative to whoever does the sensing. It is therefore plain that any sense object that is proposed to us is easily brought under the five modes, and we reason in the same way about thought objects. For if it is said that the dispute is not decidable, the necessity of suspending judgment about it will be granted us. And if the dispute is going to be decided, then if by means of a thought object we shall produce an infinite regress, while if by means of a sense object, a circular inference. For when the dispute is about the sense object, and cannot be decided by means of a sense object because of an infinite regress, there will be need of a thought object, just as for the thought object there will be need of a sense object. For these reasons, again, anyone who assumes something as a hypothesis will be acting absurdly. Furthermore, the thought objects, too, are relative, for they are so named with respect to the people who think them, and if they were in nature as they are said to be, there would be no dispute about them. Hence the thought objects, too, are brought under the five modes, so that in all cases it is necessary for us to suspend judgment about any matter proposed for consideration. Such, then, are the five modes handed down by the later skeptics. They are not put forward by way of throwing out the 10 modes, but in order to combat the precipitancy of the dogmatists in greater detail by means of both together. Part 16. The two modes. They also hand down two other modes of epoche. For since everything that is apprehended is either apprehended through itself or through something else, by pointing out that what is apprehended neither through itself nor through anything else, they produce aporiae, as they suppose, about everything. That nothing is apprehended through itself is apparent, they say, from the dispute among the physical scientists concerning not only all sense objects, but also, I think, all thought objects. A dispute that is not decidable, since we cannot use either a sense object or a thought object as a criterion, for anything we take will be in dispute, and hence not credible. And the following is the reason why they do not agree that something can be apprehended through something else. If that through which something is apprehended must in every case be apprehended through something else, they encounter the circularity or infinite regress modes of epoche. But if somebody should wish to take as apprehended through itself something through which something else is apprehended, he runs up against the fact that for the aforementioned reasons, nothing is apprehended through itself. So we are at a loss as to how the thing in question could be apprehended either on the basis of itself or on that of something else, since there is no apparent criterion of truth or of apprehension, and since signs, even apart from proof, are eliminated, as we shall show later. It will suffice for the present to have said thus much about the modes leading to suspension of judgment. Chapter 17. Some modes for refuting people who give causal explanations. Just as we hand down the modes of epoche, so some people set forth modes by which we produce aporia about particular causal explanations, thereby giving a jolt to the dogmatists since they pride themselves especially on these. Anisidmus, indeed, hands down 8 modes by means of which he thinks to refute and expose as unsound every dogmatic causal explanation. The first of these, he says, is the mode according to which causal explanations in general, concerned as they are with what is non-evident, get no agreed-upon confirmation from the appearances. The second is that according to which, although there is often a plethora of ways of giving a causal explanation of what is in question, some people give such an explanation in one way only. According to the third, they refer orderly things to causes that exhibit no order. According to the fourth, when they have apprehended how the appearances come about, they think they have apprehended how the things that are not appearances come about. Whereas, although it is possible that these latter come about similarly to the appearances, it is also possible that they come about not similarly, but in a way peculiar to themselves. The fifth mode is that according to which practically all the causal explainers give accounts based on their own particular hypotheses about the elements and not on common and generally agreed approaches. The sixth is that according to which they often accept what fits in with their own particular hypotheses, but reject what is equally credible but does not so fit in. According to the seventh, they assign causes that conflict not only with the appearances, but even with their own hypotheses. While according to the eighth, it frequently happens that when the things under investigation and the things seemingly apparent are equally puzzling, they construct their doctrine about the equally puzzling on the basis of the equally puzzling. Nor is it impossible, Anaximander says, that some should fail with their causal explanations on the basis of certain mixed modes dependent on the foregoing ones. Possibly, too, the 5 modes of epoche suffice against the causal explanations. For any cause that somebody proposes will either be compatible with all philosophical systems and with skepticism and with the appearances, or it will not. And that it will be thus compatible is impossible, I suppose, for there is disagreement about all the appearances and non-evident things. But if there is disagreement about the proposed cause, the proponent will be asked for the cause of it. And if B takes an appearance as the cause of an appearance, or a non-evident thing as the cause of a non-evident thing, he will land in an infinite regress, and in a circular inference if B takes them alternando. And if he makes a stand somewhere, either he will say that he has established the cause as such in relation to what was said before, thus introducing in relation to and eliminating in nature, or else he will take something as an hypothesis and will be brought to a standstill. So by these modes, too, it is possible, I think, to combat the precipitancy of the dogmatists in their causal theories. Chapter 18. The Skeptic Slogans. Since, in using each of these modes and those leading to suspension of judgment, we utter certain slogans expressive of the skeptic temper of mind and of our pathe, for example, not more, nothing is to be determined, and the like, it would be reasonable to take up these next. Let us begin with not more. Chapter 19. The not more slogan. We say this sometimes in the form I have just mentioned, but sometimes in the form nothing more, for we do not, as some people suppose, employ the not more in specific investigations and the nothing more in general ones. Rather, we say either not more or nothing more indifferently, and now we shall discuss them as though they were identical. This slogan, then, is elliptical. Just as when we say a duplex, we are saying in effect a duplex house, and when we say a wide platea, a square, we are saying in effect a wide street. So also when we say not more, we are saying in effect not more this than that, up than down. Some of the skeptics, however, in place of the not, adopt what more this than that, taking the what to refer to the cause, so that the meaning is because of what or why this more than that. For it is common practice to use questions instead of assertions, as in the line, what mortal doesn't know the bride of Zeus? Euripides. Hercules, line 1. and assertions instead of questions, such as, I want to know where Dion lives, and I ask why one should marvel at a poetic person. Also the use of what instead of why, that is, because of what is found in Menander, because of what was I left behind. This part of Outlines of Pyrrhonism is lost. The next available part starts with, and the slogan not more this than that, also makes evident our pathos with respect to which we reach equilibrium through the equipollence of the opposed things. Where we use the term equipollence for equality as regards what appears persuasive to us, and opposed things in the everyday sense of things that conflict, and equilibrium for the absence of assent to either alternative. Even if the slogan, nothing more, exhibits the character of assent or denial, we do not use it in that way, but rather we take it in an imprecise and not strictly correct sense, either in place of a question, or instead of saying, I don't know to which of these I ought to assent, and to which I ought not to assent. For our goal is to make evident what appears to us, and we do not care with what expression we do it. And this also should be noticed, that in uttering the nothing more slogan, we are not maintaining that it is entirely true and firm, but in its case, too, we are speaking in accord with what appears to us. Chapter 20. Non-assertion or aphasia. Concerning non-assertion, we say the following. The term assertion has two senses, a wider and a narrower. In the wider sense, an assertion is an expression indicating affirmation or denial, such as, it is day, it is not day, whereas in the narrower sense, it is an expression indicating affirmation only. In this sense, people do not call negative statements assertions. Non-assertion, then, is the avoidance of assertion in the wider sense, in which we say that both affirmation and negation are covered, so that non-assertion is a pathos of ours in view of which we say that we do not affirm or deny anything. From this it is evident that we adopt the non-assertion slogan too, not on the assumption that things are in their nature such as to produce non-assertion in every case, but simply as making evident that we now, when we are uttering it, and in the case of the particular matters in question, are experiencing this pathos. And this too must be kept in mind. It is dogmatic statements about the non-evident that we say we neither affirm nor deny. We grant the things that stir our pathe and drive us by force to assent. Chapter 21. Perhaps, it is possible, maybe. The slogans perhaps and perhaps not, and possibly not, and maybe not, we take in place of perhaps it is the case, and perhaps it is not the case, and possibly it is the case, and possibly it is not the case, and maybe it is the case, and maybe it is not the case, for brevity's sake using possibly not for possibly it is not the case, and maybe not for maybe it is not the case, and perhaps not for perhaps it is not the case. But here again we do not fight over words, nor are we raising the issue of whether the slogans make evident the nature of these matters. Rather, as I said before, we employ them imprecisely. Nevertheless, I think it is evident that these slogans are expressive of non-assertion. Certainly the person who says perhaps it is the case, by not firmly maintaining that it is the case, is in effect also asserting the seemingly inconsistent perhaps it is not the case. Similarly for the remaining slogans. Chapter 22. I withhold assent. We use I withhold assent as short for I am unable to say which of the alternatives proposed I ought to believe and which I ought not believe, indicating that the matters appear equal to us as regards credibility and incredibility. As to whether they are equal, we maintain no firm opinion, but we do state what appears to us to be the case about them when that appearance affects us. And withholding assent or epoche is so called from the intellect's being held back or epichesthai in such a way as neither to assert nor deny, because of the equipollence of the matters in question. Chapter 23. I determine nothing. Concerning I determine nothing, we say the following. We think that determining is not simply saying something, but rather is putting forward and assenting to something non-evident. Thus, I suppose, the skeptic will be found not to be determining anything, not even the slogan, "I determine nothing" itself. For that slogan is not a dogmatic opinion, that is, an assent to the non-evident, but rather it makes evident our pathos. Whenever the skeptic says, "I determine nothing," B is saying this: I am now in such a state of mind as neither dogmatically to affirm nor deny any of the matters in question. And this, he says, reporting what appears to him concerning the matters at hand, not dogmatically and confidently, but just as a description of his state of mind, his pathos. Chapter 24. Everything is indeterminate. Indeterminateness is a pathos of the intellect in accord with which we take neither a negative nor an affirmative position on the matters of dogmatic inquiry, that is, the non-evident. Whenever the skeptic says everything is indeterminate, he uses is in place of appears to me to be. And with everything he does not refer simply to all there is, but rather to the dogmatist's non-evident objects that are under his consideration. And by indeterminate he means not standing out as superior, as regards credibility and incredibility, among the things that are opposite or mutually inconsistent. And just as the person who says, "I'm walking around," is in effect saying, "I am walking around," so, according to us, the one who is saying, "Everything is indeterminate," means also as relates to me, or as appears to me. Consequently, what is said comes down to this: all the matters of dogmatic inquiry that I have considered appear to me to be such that not one of them seems to me superior, as regards credibility and incredibility, to anything inconsistent with it. Chapter 25. Everything is non-apprehensible. And we adopt a similar stance, too, when we say everything is non-apprehensible. For we explain everything in the same way, and we add to me, so that what is said amounts to this: all of the non-evident matters of dogmatic inquiry that I have considered appear to me to be non-apprehensible. This is not the assertion of one who is firmly maintaining that the things investigated by the dogmatists are of such a nature as to be non-apprehensible, but rather of one who is reporting his own pathos, in accord with which he says, "I take it that up to now, because of the equivalence of the opposites, I have apprehended none of them, and consequently, everything that is brought forward by way of refutation seems to me to be irrelevant to what we are reporting." Chapter 26. I am non-apprehensive, and I do not apprehend. Both of the slogans, "I am non-apprehensive and I do not apprehend," express a personal pathos, in accord with which the skeptic declines for the present to take an affirmative or negative position on any of the non-evident matters of inquiry, as is evident from what we have previously said about the other slogans. Chapter 27. To every argument an equal argument is opposed. When we say to every argument an equal argument is opposed, by every argument we mean every argument that has been considered by us, and we use argument not in its ordinary sense but for that which establishes something dogmatically, that is to say, concerning the non-evident, and which establishes it in any way at all, not necessarily by means of premises and conclusion. We say equal as regards credibility and the lack of it, and we use opposed in its common meaning of conflicting, and we tacitly supply as appears to me. Thus, when I say to every argument an equal argument is opposed, I say in effect this: for every argument that I have examined and that establishes something dogmatically, there appears to me to be opposed another argument that establishes something dogmatically and is equal to it as regards credibility and lack of credibility, so that the utterance of the statement is not dogmatic, but is just a report of a human pathos, which is apparent to the person experiencing it. But also some people state the slogan thus: to every argument an equal argument is to be opposed, intending to give this admonition: to every argument establishing something dogmatically, let us oppose some conflicting argument that proceeds dogmatically and is equal to it as regards credibility and lack of credibility. They are addressing the statement to the skeptic, although they use the infinitive, to be opposed in place of the imperative, let us oppose. And they address this admonition to the skeptic, lest he be tricked somehow by the dogmatist into ceasing to raise questions about the arguments, and through precipitancy should miss out on the ataraxia that appears to them, and that they, as we mentioned before, think follows on suspension of judgment about everything. Chapter 28. More about the skeptic's slogans. This will be a sufficient number of the slogans to discuss in an outline, especially since, on the basis of what we have already said, it is possible to give an account of the rest. For concerning all the skeptic's slogans, it is necessary for this to be understood first of all. We absolutely do not firmly maintain anything about their being true, especially since we say that they can confuted by themselves, as they are included among the cases to which they apply. Just as cathartic drugs not only flush out the bodily humors but expel themselves as well. Also, we do not put them forward as sharply expressing the points with which they have to do, but we employ them imprecisely and, if you like, not strictly correctly, for it does not befit the skeptic to fight about slogans, and besides it works in our favor that not even these slogans are said to have signification absolutely, but only relatively, that is, relative to the skeptics. In addition, it must be borne in mind that we do not apply them to all things in general, but only to things that are non-evident and are investigated dogmatically, and that we are saying what appears to us and are not asserting, as something firmly maintained, anything about the nature of the external objects. On the basis of these points, I think it possible to fend off every sophism against the skeptic's slogan. And now that we have elucidated the character of skepticism, reviewing its basic idea, parts, criterion, and goal, and the modes of epoche, too, and have discussed the skeptic's slogans, we consider that the next thing to do is to go over concisely the distinction between it and the alternative philosophies, in order that we may understand more clearly the effective way. Let us begin with the Heraclitean philosophy. Chapter 29. That the skeptic way differs from the Heraclitean philosophy. Now it is evident from the start that the Heraclitean philosophy differs from our way, for Heraclitus makes dogmatic assertions about many non-evident things, but as has been said, we do not. It is true that Anicedemus and his followers used to say that the skeptic way was a road to the Heraclitean philosophy, since opposites appearing to be the case about the same thing leads into opposites being the case about the same thing. And the skeptics say that opposites appear to be the case about the same thing, while the Heracliteans move from this to their being the case. But we reply to them that opposites appearing to be the case about the same thing is not a dogma of the skeptics, but a matter occurring not only to the skeptics, but also to the other philosophers, and indeed to all mankind. For surely nobody would bring himself to say that honey does not taste sweet to healthy people, and that it does not taste bitter to the jaundiced. So the Heracliteans, just as we and perhaps the other philosophers, start from an assumption common to everybody. Therefore, if the Heracliteans had got their opposites are the case about the same thing from one or another of the skeptic slogans, such as, for example, everything is non-apprehensible, I determine nothing, or the like, perhaps Anicedemus and his followers might have validly drawn their conclusion. But since what the Heracliteans start from is something observed not only by us, but by the other philosophers and the plain man as well, why would anyone claim that our way, any more than the other philosophies or the plain man's view, is a road to the Heraclitean philosophy, since we all utilize the same materials in common? Indeed, not only does the skeptic way not promote acceptance of the Heraclitean philosophy, but it actually works against it, for the skeptic rejects all Heraclitus's dogmatic assertions as precipitate pronouncements opposing his world conflagration, and his opposites are the case concerning the same thing. And as I was saying before, in regard to each dogma of Heraclitus, he derides the dogmatic precipitancy and reiterates, I do not apprehend, and I do not determine anything, all of which conflicts with the Heracliteans. Now it is absurd to say that a conflicting way is a road to the system with which it conflicts. Therefore, it is absurd to say that the skeptic way is a road to the Heraclitean philosophy. Chapter 30, wherein skepticism differs from the Democritean philosophy. But the Democritean philosophy, too, is said to have something in common with skepticism, since it seems to use the same material as we do. For from honey's appearing sweet to some people and bitter to others, Democritus, as they say, reasons that it is neither sweet nor bitter, and in view of this he joins in sounding the skeptic slogan, not more. But the skeptics and the followers of Democritus use the slogan, not more, differently, since the latter apply it in reference to neither alternative being the case, whereas we ape it in reference to our not knowing whether both or neither of the appearances is the case, so that we differ also in respect to this. And the difference becomes most evident when Democritus says, truly, there are atoms and the void, for he says truly instead of in truth. And it is superfluous to state, I think, that he differs from us when he says that in truth atoms and the void exist, although he does start from the anomaly of the appearances. Chapter 31, wherein skepticism differs from the Cyrenaic way. Some people say that the Cyrenaic way is the same as the skeptic way, since it too says that only pathe are apprehensible. But it differs, for it says that pleasure and the smooth transition from state to state of the body are the goal, while we say that it is ataraxia, which is incompatible with their goal. For the person who firmly maintains that pleasure is the goal undergoes torments whether or not pleasure is present, as I have argued in the section on the goal. Further, we suspend judgment as regards the philosophic theory about the external objects, whereas the Cyrenaics assert that these objects have a nature that is not apprehensible. Chapter 32, wherein skepticism differs from the Pythagorean way. Pythagoras thinks that man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. And by measure he means the criterion, and by things he means objects or facts. So in effect he says that man is the criterion of all objects or facts, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. And for this reason he posits only what appears to each person, and thus he introduces relativity. Wherefore he too seems to have something in common with the Pyrrhonians. But he differs from them, and we shall see the difference when we have properly set forth what Pythagoras thinks. He says that matter is in flux, and that as it flows, additions are continuously made, replacing the effluvia, and that the senses are restructured and altered depending on the age and the other structural features of our bodies. He says also that the explanations of all appearances are founded on matter, as matter in itself is capable of being in all respects such as it appears to anyone. And he says that people apprehend different things at different times, depending on the different conditions they are in. For the person who is in a natural condition apprehends those features of matter that appear to people who are in a natural condition, while those who are in an unnatural condition apprehend what can appear to people in an unnatural condition. And the same account applies in relation to age and as regards being asleep or awake, and for each type of condition. For him, therefore, man becomes the criterion of existence, since whatever appears to somebody exists, and what does not appear to anybody does not exist. We see, therefore, that he dogmatizes both about matter being in flux and about the explanations of all appearances being founded on it, while these are non-evident matters concerning which we suspend judgment. Chapter 33, wherein skepticism differs from the academic philosophy. Some, of course, claim that the academic philosophy is the same as skepticism, and so the next step will be to discuss this too. According to most people, there have been three academics. The first and most ancient is the school of Plato and his followers. The second, or middle academy, is that of Arcesilaus, the pupil of Polemo, and the third, or new academy, is that of Carneades and Cleitomachus. Some add a fourth, the school of Philo and Charmides, and some even reckon the school of Antiochus as a fifth. Beginning then with the old academy, let us see how these philosophies differ from ours. Some people have said that Plato was dogmatic, others that he was aporetic, and still others that he was aporetic in some respects and dogmatic in others. For B shows, they say, a gymnastic and aporetic character in his gymnastic discourses, where Socrates is introduced either as making sport of someone or as contending with the sophists, but a dogmatic character where he speaks seriously through Socrates or Timaeus or some such personage. Concerning those who say that B is dogmatic or that he is dogmatic in some respects and aporetic in others, it would be superfluous to say anything now, for they concede his difference from us. The question whether he is, strictly speaking, skeptical, we treat more fully in our commentaries. But now we shall argue in brief against the school of Menodotus and Anaximander, for these most of all advance this position, that whenever Plato makes statements about the ideas, or about the existence of providence, or about the virtuous life being more choice-worthy than the wicked, if B assents to these as being more plausible than not, he also abandons the skeptic character, since he gives preference to one thing over another, as regards credibility and incredibility. From what has been said before, it is very evident that this is alien to us, and if he does put forward some points skeptically whenever, as they say, he is doing gymnastics, that does not make him a skeptic, for he who dogmatizes about any single thing or prefers any fantasia at all to any other as regards credibility and incredibility, or makes an assertion about something non-evident, acquires the dogmatic character, as Timon, too, shows by what B says about Xenophanes. For, after praising him in many respects and even dedicating his satires to him, he portrays him as making this lamentation: I, too, should have had wisdom of mind when I was vacillating. But, being old and not completely versed in skepticism, I was deceived by the treacherous pathway. For in whichever direction I turned my mind, everything was resolved into one and the same, and everything, continually drawn in all directions, wound up in a single common nature. By reason of this, indeed, Timon describes him as more or less free from delusion, but not completely free, where B says, Xenophanes, fairly free from delusion, mocker of Homer's fiction, invented a god far removed from humankind, spherical in shape, unshakable, unblemished, and surpassing thought in his thinking. He calls him fairly free from delusion as being on some points not deluded, and mocker of Homer's fiction because he ridiculed Homer's stories about divine tricks. But Xenophanes, contrary to the preconceptions of the rest of mankind, asserted dogmatically that everything is one, and that God coalesces with everything and is spherical in shape, devoid of pathé, unchangeable and reasonable, whence it is easy to show the difference between Xenophanes and us. In any case, it is very evident from what has been said that even if Plato is aporetic about some things, B is not a skeptic, because in some respects he appears to be making assertions about the existence of non-evident things, or to be preferring one non-evident thing to another as regards credibility. The members of the new academy, although they say that all things are non-apprehensible, differ from the skeptics, it appears, even in the very statement that all things are non-apprehensible, for they firmly maintain this, while it seems to the skeptic that maybe something can be apprehended, but they differ from us very evidently in the judgment of things good and evil. For the academics say that something is good or evil, not as we do, but having been persuaded that what they call good is good more likely than not, and similarly in the case of evil. Whereas we say such things, not with the thought that what we are saying is plausible, but without any belief, following the common course of life in order not to be incapable of action. And we say that, so far as the philosophic theory is concerned, fantasiae are equal as regards credibility and incredibility, but they say that some are plausible and others the reverse, and they draw distinctions among the plausible fantasiae. Some, they think, are just plausible, some are plausible and tested, and some are plausible, tested, and stable. For example, when a rope is lying coiled up in a dark room, a person who enters the room suddenly gets a simply plausible fantasia that it is a snake. But to a person who has looked carefully around and considered the circumstances, for example, that it does not move, that it is of such and such a color, and so on, it appears to be a rope, in accord with a fantasia that is plausible and tested. And a fantasia that is in addition stable is such as the following. After Alcestis had died, Heracles is said to have brought her up again from Hades, and to have shown her to Admetus, who got a plausible and tested fantasia of Alcestis. But since he knew that she had died, his intellect withdrew the assent and leaned toward disbelief. Accordingly, the new academics prefer the plausible and tested fantasia to the simply plausible, and to both of them the fantasia that is plausible, tested, and stable. And although both the academics and the skeptics say that they are persuaded of certain things, here too the difference of the philosophies is very evident. For to be persuaded has different senses. On the one hand, it means not to resist, but simply to follow without much proclivity or strong pro-feeling, as the child is said to be persuaded by or obedient to his teacher. But sometimes it means to assent to something by choice and with a kind of sympathy due to strong desire, as when a profligate man is persuaded by one who approves of living extravagantly. Since, therefore, the followers of Carneades and Cleitomachus say both that they are strongly persuaded and that things are strongly persuasive, whereas we say that we simply make a concession without any pro-feeling, we would differ from them in this respect too. But we also differ from the new academy as regards the goal, for whereas the gentlemen who say that they conduct themselves in accord with the plausible employ it in everyday life, we live without belief, following the laws, customs, and our natural path. And if we were not aiming at brevity, we could say still more about this distinction. Arcesilaus, however, who we said was the head and founder of the Middle Academy, does indeed seem to me to share the Pyrrhonian arguments, so that his way is almost the same as ours. For one does not find him making any assertion about the existence or non-existence of anything, nor does he prefer one thing to another as regards credibility or incredibility. Rather, he suspends judgment about everything, and he asserts that the goal is suspension of judgment, which, we were saying, is accompanied by ataraxia. He further says that individual cases of suspension are good, and that individual cases of assent are bad. One might note, however, that while we say these things in accord with what is apparent to us, and we do not firmly maintain them, he says them as holding in nature, so as to mean that the suspension itself is good and the assent is bad. And if one is to believe what is said about him, B appeared at first glance to be a Pyrrhonian, they say. But in truth B was a dogmatist, and since B undertook to test his associates by the aporetic method, to see whether they were naturally fitted to receive the Platonic dogmas, he seemed to be aporetic, but in fact he did pass on the Platonic dogmas to those of his associates who were naturally fitted. And this was why Ariston said of him, "He is Plato in front, Pyrrho in back, and Diodorus in the middle." For he made use of the dialectic of Diodorus, but he was an outright Platonist. The followers of Philo say that, insofar as it depends on the Stoic criterion, that is, the apprehensive fantasia, objects and facts are not apprehensible, but that insofar as it depends on the nature of the objects and facts themselves, they are apprehensible. Antiochus even transferred the Stoa to the Academy, so that it was said of him that in the Academy he did Stoic philosophy, for he showed that the Stoic dogmas are in Plato. So the difference between the skeptic way and the so-called fourth and fifth academics is quite evident. Chapter 34. Whether medical empiricism is the same as skepticism. Since some say that the empiricism of the empirical medical system is the same as the skeptic philosophy, it needs to be recognized that inasmuch as empiricism firmly maintains the inapprehensibility of the non-evident, it is not the same as skepticism, nor would it befit a skeptic to take up that system. He might better adopt the so-called method, it seems to me, for it alone of the medical system seems not to make precipitate assertions about non-evident things by self-assuredly telling us whether they are apprehensible or not apprehensible, and following the appearances, it takes from them what seems beneficial in accord with the skeptic practice. For we said above that everyday life, in which the skeptic shares, has four parts, one involving nature's guidance, another involving the compulsion of the pathe, still another the tradition of laws and customs, and a fourth the teaching of arts. Accordingly, just as the skeptic, in accord with the compulsion of the pathe, is led by thirst to drink and by hunger to food, and similarly in the other cases, so too the methodic physician is led by the pathe to what is appropriate by tightness to loosening up, as when one seeks refuge in heat from a cold-induced attack of cramping, and by secretion to drying up, as when people in a sauna, relaxed and sweating profusely, come to the end of the session and with that in mind betake themselves to the cold air. It is also very evident that conditions that are naturally alien impel us to their removal, seeing that even the dog, when stuck by a thorn, proceeds to pull it out. And so in sum, in order not to depart from the outline form by taking up each point individually, I consider that all the things thus said by the methodics can be classed as instances of the compulsion of the pathe, whether these pathe are natural or unnatural. Also common to the two ways is the undogmatic and relaxed use of words. For just as the skeptic uses the slogans, I determine nothing and I apprehend nothing, undogmatically, as we have said, so also the methodic physician employs common features and pervade and the like in an uncomplicated way. So, too, he uses the word indication undogmatically, as short for the guidance of the apparent pathe, both natural and unnatural, to the seemingly appropriate remedies, analogous to what I said in the case of hunger and thirst and the rest. Thus it must be said, on the basis of these and similar significant features, that the methodic physician's way has a kinship with skepticism. And indeed, when considered not simply in itself, but in comparison with the other medical systems, it has more kinship than they do. With this much said about the seeming alternatives to the skeptic way, we here complete both the general account of skepticism and Book 1 of the Outlines. Our audiobook ends here. Thank you for listening. If you want any particular book on this channel, please let us know in the comments.